Okay, we're live, I think.
You have your Skype locked, so.
Hello, testing 1, 2, 3. Hello, testing 1, 2, 3.
Information and consultation on nuclear power and nuclear radiation in the United States and, as of today, Canada. Please welcome Arnie Gunderson.
It's not up there. Oh.
Sorry, he's not up there yet.
I can hear you.
Well, Arnie, you can start talking and somebody's going to get your picture up here yet.
All right, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. I wish I could be there in person, but this is the next best thing to being there. Today I wanted to talk about the Fukushima Daiichi disaster and compare it to Chernobyl to try to give you as physicians an idea about how the two disasters compare. Just about to this moment, 1 year ago, I was confident that the Fukushima reactors were in a meltdown. Now that doesn't mean I'm clairvoyant. I'm sure when I look at the NRC transcripts that the NRC knew as well that a meltdown was occurring just about this time. That's not what they told us, though. So I'd like to open today with a suggestion that we all take a moment and honor several thousand very brave men and women at the Fukushima Daiichi plant, as well as the Fukushima Danai plant. Both of them almost had meltdowns, and of course 3 units at Fukushima did. But were it not for those several thousand people, Japan would be cut in half, and the nation of Japan would no longer exist, and likely, certainly, Vancouver and the West Coast would be very, very contaminated as well. So I think we all owe a debt of debt to those several thousand people who risked their lives today and for the next week or two a year ago to save the plant, to save the nation, and likely to save the world. I also wanted to thank just briefly the translators for the Fairewinds website, as well as the Fairewinds team led by my wife Maggie, who is the brains behind this outfit. Now let's get on to the topic at hand. The Mark I design.
Hello?
Has long been known.
Okay, sorry, Arnie, our technician has still not got you up so everybody can see you. So just pause for a minute, and he is busily running around plugging cords in.
Hold on.
Can you hear me?
He wants to show.
Hold on. I'll put the slides on this computer, and you can hear his voice from here, so it'll work out well. Hopefully.
Okay, I'm on slide 3.
Yeah, just a second.
Okay, I'm on slide 3.
Where is this slide? Arnie?
Yes, I am here.
Sorry, what?
Yes, I am here.
Yeah, sure.
Is your camera?
worked 2 hours. It worked 2 hours ago.
Let's do this one. Let's do it this way. We can have his speech. She can have his slides.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, Arnie?
Yes, hi.
So are we on the slide called Long History of Danger?
Yes, hi.
So just let me know if you want to move the slide to the next, and I'll do the change.
Do it here.
Yeah,
We are.
great.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, go ahead.
Again. Okay, thanks. Leading up to this accident, it was pretty clear that the Mark 1 again. Had a long history. Leading up to this accident, those problems, it was pretty clear that the Mark 1 containment had a long history of problems. Those problems include a containment that was too small, it's been known for 40 years, hold-down straps that were added after the fact because engineers thought the forces would be down and it turned out they were up. Venting of the containment because of hydrogen buildup, which engineers never ever anticipated. As a result of all this, Maggie and I were walking about 3 weeks before the accident, and Maggie said, you know, what do you think, where do you think will be the next nuclear accident? And I told her, I don't know where, but I do know it's going to be in a Mark 1 containment. And of course, the Fukushima reactors were a Mark 1 containment. So there was that piece, the technical piece, but then in addition there was the geologic piece, and also for 20 years at least, serious scientists in Japan knew that the tsunami risks were being underestimated by the Japanese government. Even 8 days before the accident, Tokyo Electric was convincing the Japanese government that there really wasn't a tsunami risk and they needed to study it more rather than build the seawall higher. So this wasn't an accident. This was an accident waiting to happen for at least 20 years and likely 40 years. It's interesting because at in the heat of the battle, 1 day into the accident, someone on an NRC conference call blurted out, "This is the worst containment in the world." So while the NRC has been telling people for years that this containment is just fine, when push came to shove on the day of the accident, they clearly knew otherwise. Okay, I'm on next slide. The accident started with an earthquake, and there's the myth of a safe shutdown. When a nuclear plant shuts down, it really doesn't shut down. 95% of the heat goes away when the control rods drop in, but 5% remains. And that's because the nuclear fission is stopped, but all of the fission products, all of the pieces of uranium remain radioactive, and that's the problem. Even when the reactor stops, the heat does not stop. So for a plant like Fukushima 2, that's about 200,000 to 300,000 horsepower that has to be gotten rid of in a room about the size of a small bedroom. I think you can imagine the heat problem. Well, when the earthquake occurred before the tsunami, clearly there was already a problem in Unit 1 because radiation levels were increasing inside the building and at the fence posts, even before the tsunami hit. Next slide. The tsunami. Well, when the tsunami hit, I'm sure you've all heard that the diesels were flooded and they were unable to get electricity into the large pumps required. We call that loss of off-site power and then a station blackout. Engineers thought a blackout would occur, maybe last for 2 or 3 hours, and they put batteries in that lasted as many as 4 or 5, 6 hours. Well, the batteries began to fail also. So by this time a year ago, I knew the batteries were failing, and that meant that a meltdown was inevitable. When the fuel begins to get hot, the fuel rods begin to crack, and that lets out noble gases. And if you remember, noble gases don't react with anything. So at least 3 nuclear cores worth of noble gases were released within, certainly within 12 hours of the accident beginning. As the fuel gets hotter still, the zirconium clad begins to ignite. It burns in water. It strips the hydrogen away from the oxygen atoms and becomes Zirc oxide, creating hydrogen. Well, that hydrogen gas builds up, and the containment it fills with hydrogen gas. It was never designed for this. At this point, clearly heroic efforts of the staff were required. The valves that were designed to vent this containment couldn't be opened because they needed electricity. And men went into high radiation areas in the dark and opened valves to begin to relieve the pressure. They were not completely successful. I'm on slide 6. The pressure in the containment began to increase, and what that means is that the containment began to leak. Not just through the vents that the men tried to open, but literally the bolts that hold the containment together began to grow with the pressure and release hydrogen into the surrounding buildings. At that point, all it took was a spark to ignite the buildings. Slide 7 shows Unit 1 exploding, and this is what we call a deflagration, a shock wave that was less than the speed of sound. That occurred on the first day. That was a hydrogen explosion because the containment didn't contain. Slide 8 shows Unit 3 exploding, a dramatically greater explosion that literally went up as high as 3,000 meters. And the speed was much faster, and the building is totally destroyed. Slide 9 shows what appears to be an intact building at Unit 2, except you'll notice the box in the front of the building with steam coming out. That shows that there was an explosion internal to the building. While the building is intact, the containment was breached. That steam should not be coming out the side of the building. So we have 3 containments that were breached from internal explosions. Slide 10 shows Unit 4. Unit 4 had no fuel in the nuclear reactor. It was all removed into the spent fuel pool and is in fact the most dangerous of the 4 on site. It blew up, and there's lots of competing theories about why, but the key is it blew up. This is the reason that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission told the Americans within 50 miles or 80 kilometers to evacuate. The nuclear fuel in this reactor, Unit 4, didn't have any containment around it. And if it were to burn, Brookhaven National Laboratories has estimated that 186,000 people would die of cancer relatively quickly after the building caught fire. This is the building today that could still cut Japan in half if there's a major seismic event. I'm on slide 11. There's several lessons technically that we can learn from the first week or 2 of the accident. The first is the inadequate design bases. And what that means is that as engineers and scientists, we didn't anticipate the worst that Mother Nature could throw at a plant. The next one is seismic problems. Unit 1 failed before the tsunami got there. That's an indication that seismic analyses need to be modified. The next one is loss of an off-site power, and together with loss of the ultimate heat sink. Those two occurred when the tsunami hit, the diesels were flooded, and more importantly, and this is not even discussed yet, and should be because it affects the Canadian reactors as well as reactors worldwide. The pumps along the ocean that cool the diesels and that cool the nuclear reactor were destroyed. So even if the diesels had survived, there was no way to keep the core cool. It's called loss of ultimate heat sink. Here in the States, the NRC is studying it, hasn't done anything about it, but it is the most serious global issue relating to this incident. We all know that the Mark I containment was inadequate and that venting was also inadequate. Next slide. Well, I wanted to use most of this presentation's time to compare Chernobyl's releases to Fukushima's releases. It was clear to me that on the second day of the accident, Fukushima was as bad as or worse than Chernobyl. We call that a level 7, which is as high as the scale goes. Now there's some differences. The Chernobyl release was a single reactor, and it lasted for less than 2 weeks. The Fukushima release was 10 nuclear reactor cores. Now what do I mean by that? We had 3 nuclear reactors that were operating, and we had about 7 nuclear reactor cores in their spent fuel pools. So 10 nuclear reactor cores potentially could release radioactivity into the environment. Chernobyl stopped releasing after about 2 weeks, and of course now we're a year into the Fukushima accident, and it is still releasing radioactive material. I'm on slide 13. Well, the key for this accident, the Chernobyl accident, and also 3 Mile Island, is that no one measured the releases. At 3 Mile Island, all of the radiation detectors were designed only to detect low-level radiation, and they were destroyed during the accident because the radiation levels were so high. At Chernobyl, the explosion exceeded what the instrumentation was capable of, and also, of course, the radiation went out beyond where the instrumentation was. And at Fukushima, the electricity that powers the radiation monitors failed, so no one knows on an hour-to-hour or minute-to-minute basis what Fukushima released. But the releases come in 4 different categories. There's noble gases. The noble gases were released for sure when the fuel began to crack. This is 2 or 3 to 12 hours after the accident. Now, if you remember your chemistry, noble gases don't react with anything. This is xenon and krypton. You'll also remember that xenon is used medicinally. I think it's xenon 133 is used as a radioisotope. It's fat soluble and absorbed in your body. Now we know for sure that 3 to 5 times Chernobyl's releases of noble gases definitely have been measured. There's good scientific papers that show that from the noble gases, 3 to 5 times Chernobyl were released. To the northeast of the reactor, we know that the noble gas concentrations were something on the order of 1,000 disintegrations per second in a cubic meter of air for the first 5 or 6 days of the accident. Well, the next one is iodine. There are lots of questions about how much iodine was released because iodine does react chemically with the components in the building. But we're certain that iodine was picked up worldwide from the event, and even nuclear reactors here in the States were picking it up within several days of the beginning of the accident. The plant released iodine. The question is how much, and I'll get to that later. I'm sure you've also seen cesium numbers. That's the easiest isotope to measure. It doesn't mean there's not many other isotopes present, but the cesium concentrations in the soil are the easiest ones to measure. And lastly, you have heavy isotopes like plutonium, and those have also been detected as far as 50 kilometers away from the reactor. Now, one definite similarity between 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima is the fact that there have been government cover-ups of the radiation that's been released. At Chernobyl, researchers were intimidated and in fact arrested and thrown in jail for as long as 3 to 5 years because they tried to investigate the releases. I have friends who've tried to go into Belarus even now, and they're refused access when they realize that their purpose is to research the accident. At Chernobyl, we know the demographic data was missing and in some cases deliberately destroyed. At 3 Mile Island, we know that the demographic data was never applied. As a matter of fact, the federal judge on the case limited the scientific analysis and told the researchers that if they came up with too high a number, she wasn't going to believe it. So we've got definite government cover-ups at Chernobyl, and I refer you to an excellent book. And I don't believe the video is working now, but I'm going to hold it up to my camera. And it's called Chernobyl: Consequences of a Catastrophe. And it's by Alexei Yablokov and others, and it was published by the New York Academy of Sciences. It used to be on sale for $150 a copy, but because many people are very interested in getting this book out, the cost has been reduced to $15. It's an excellent piece of work, hundreds of pages of peer-reviewed analysis, and if you can't find it on the web for something on the order of $15, if you contact Fairewinds on the contact page, we can get you copies or get you in touch with one. So we're also aware that the Japanese are attempting to minimize the consequences of the accident as well. So government reaction to all three accidents has been to minimize the consequences and also try to marginalize the scientists who are doing the work. I'm on slide 15. So how bad was the Fukushima accident? The secret is in the assumptions, and I'll let you take a look at this this Dilbert comic for about 10 seconds for the comment to sink in. I think what Dilbert is trying to tell us is that everybody can do the math, but the question is what assumptions went into the math. And the key is in the assumptions. I'm on slide 16. So what really are the public health consequences? There's about a half a dozen different assumptions that need to be factored in. And when I watch the industry, as they have been over the last 5 or 6 days, it's clear that they are trying to minimize each and every one of these assumptions. First assumption is how much radiation was available to be released. Well, as I've already said, there was 3 operating reactors compared to 1 at Chernobyl. Plus, we had 7 nuclear reactor cores in fuel pools that were uncooled as well. So potentially there's as much as 10 nuclear reactor cores available to be released. What were the timings of the release? Chernobyl failed almost immediately, but it was only at 7% power when it did fail. Fukushima units 1, 2, and 3 failed in 12 to 36 hours, but they were running at 100% power when the accident occurred. So releases could be significantly larger from Fukushima. I've already said that scientists have pretty convincingly determined that 3 to 5 times Chernobyl gases were released as noble gases, and so therefore that tells us that essentially every piece of fuel failed inside of the 3 operating reactors, and perhaps additional fuel failed in the fuel pools. What was the timing of the releases? No one knows, because there were no radiation detectors present. But again, this is a number that's subject to assumption. If you assume the predominant releases occurred when the wind was blowing inland, you'll get one number. If you assume the wind was blowing when the wind blows out to sea, you'll get another number. So the timing of the releases in coordination with the meteorology can produce dramatically different calculations of the exposure to people within Japan. The next one down, decontamination. What that means is that there's water underneath a nuclear reactor. And for the last 20 years, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has assumed that 99% of the cesium gets trapped in that water. Well, there's a problem there, because after Fukushima, that water boiled because it had no cooling water, getting back to the loss of the ultimate heat sink I talked about earlier. The NRC has also said that if the water boils, no cesium will be held up in the water, and all of it is subject to be released. So the question is, what are the various people calculating doses, assuming for the decontamination factor for cesium? I've seen the Japanese assume that 99% was retained. There's an Australian study out, though, that shows that 90% was retained. That doesn't sound like a lot. It's in fact 10 times more cesium the Australians are assuming than are the Japanese. So what that number is a critical piece of analysis that I found that the nuclear industry and the Japanese are consistently trying to downplay. What was the meteorology like on the day of the event? If there's good news in the Fukushima disaster, and I don't think good news and disaster really belong together, but if there's good news, it's that most of the time the wind was blowing out to sea. Now, at Chernobyl, the reactor was surrounded by people, and surrounded by farmland, and surrounded by cities. Here, at least half of the compass was the ocean, and this accident would have cut Japan in half already, were it not for the fact that the wind was blowing out to sea. Now, there's other pieces too. Of course, the Fukushima prefecture has mountains immediately to the west, and those mountains prevented a lot of radiation from reaching the west coast of Japan. But now we've got contaminated forests that can essentially never be decontaminated. In the next several months, you're going to hear about contaminated cedar, and as the pollen is released this year from the cedar trees, we'll have an enormous amount of cesium being revolatilized into the atmosphere. So the Fukushima accident isn't over. The cesium's being re-released by Mother Nature. Also, the cesium is being washed into rivers, and the rivers, of course, are heading toward the ocean. But we're seeing contamination in freshwater fish as well as ocean fish as a result of all the runoff through the mountain ranges in the Fukushima prefecture. We're also seeing large cesium deposits in the bottom soil on the bottom of riverbeds, and of course that gets picked up by weeds and seaweed in the ocean that then get eaten by other fish and mollusks and work their way up the food chain. So we're seeing cesium concentrate in riverbeds, and this is not a problem that's going to go away in the next year. We're looking at a long-term problem of cesium contamination. I was in Tokyo 2 weeks ago, and I just randomly picked 5 sample locations as I was in the city, and put them in bags, brought them back, cleared them through customs, and sent them to the lab. And each one of those bags has contamination levels of dirt that would be qualified as nuclear waste and buried in Texas here in the United States. But the people in Tokyo, more than 200 kilometers away, are essentially walking on radioactive waste every day. So as doctors, you've got a public health issue throughout northern Japan from this chronic exposure to low-level radiation, and then you've got a personal health issue for the people in Fukushima Prefecture who have been exposed to well over 10 rem of radiation from the accident. I'm on slide 17. So which was worse, the Fukushima accident or the Chernobyl accident? They were both awful. I noticed that in reading Mikhail Gorbachev's memoirs, he credits Chernobyl, not perestroika, but Chernobyl, with causing the downfall of the Soviet Union. And of course, I'm sure you've also heard in the last 2 weeks that Tokyo was almost evacuated as a result of this, of the Fukushima accident. Even today, if there's a significant earthquake and one of the fuel pools collapses at Fukushima, Japan still could be cut in half. So which is worse? I go back to the first line. They were both awful. We're talking about a technology that has the capability to destroy a nation. I'm on slide 18. There's a long-term cleanup effort that's going to be required by the Japanese. I don't believe the Japanese have recognized the severity of the problem yet. They seem to be nickel-diming it and spending, $1 billion here and $1 billion there. But in fact, the total cost of this cleanup is now estimated to be $500 billion. That's $500 billion US to clean up the site and the surrounding prefectures. Now, nuclear experts on television have been saying, well, the accident was bad, but we're never going to find any injuries. I disagree. When I look at the use of their assumptions, I can find error after error that make them non-conservative. In fact, I believe that over the next 20 years, we're going to see about 1 million additional cancers and other health problems as a result of the accident. That's quite a broad span, from 0 with nuclear experts paid for by the industry to 1 million by me and other independent scientists. Only time will tell, and frankly, I hope I'm wrong, but I'm quite sure I'm not. Now, I get that number from the 3 Mile Island accident. People did die after 3 Mile Island. There was as a result of the trial, Judge Rambo authorized a study. The study showed that there were extra cancer deaths from 3 Mile Island. Now, 3 Mile Island was 1,000 times smaller than Fukushima, and yet we determined there were extra cancer deaths after 3 Mile Island. Now, the judge said, well, yeah, but because the releases were so low, I don't believe that. Well, Dr. Stephen Wing published a peer-reviewed paper, and that's also on our website, the Fairewinds website, where he shows that clearly there's at least a 10 to 20% increase in lung cancers for people that were exposed in the first 10 days of the accident. So based on 3 Mile Island, which was 1,000 to 100,000 times smaller than Fukushima, I believe it's reasonable that we'll have as many as 1 million additional cancers after Fukushima. The other parts of the problem are systemic within Japan. Japan is dispersing the contamination with incineration. Now what they're doing, as an example, in a school near Tokyo, they found some highly contaminated material. And rather than dispose of that as high-level waste, they diluted it 1,000 to 1 with clean material and put it in incinerators, and then took that 1,000 times more ash and poured it into Tokyo Bay. So they believe that dilution is the solution to pollution, and in fact what they're doing is they're putting cesium in the soil that will be enormously more expensive to remove later. I think the reason is that the Japanese are protecting Tokyo Electric's financial short-term interests comparing to protecting the long-term interests of their own population. On slide 19, Japan does have an alternative. They can go with the technology of the 21st century, which is distributed generation, smart grids, and renewables, vehicle-to-grid technology called V2G technology. The concept that we need central stations made sense in the 20th century. We didn't have computers in the systems we've got now to integrate a grid. But now in the 21st century, we can distribute our generation, and these distributed smart grids will be the way of the 21st century. So Japan's got a chance. Japan can be an economic powerhouse, and it can export this new technology, or it can go back into the central station paradigm of the 20th century. So my conclusions are, what I took away from the Fukushima accident is that it's impossible to predict the worst event that Mother Nature or humans in the form of tourists can do to a nuclear power plant. The other piece is that nuclear power, when things go wrong, which isn't very frequently, but when things go wrong, it's a technology that can destroy a nation. It can destroy it financially or environmentally. So for those two reasons, we've got a high risk but low probability technology, but that no one can anticipate the worst Mother Nature can throw at us. In the States, it can be a dam break. In Canada,
Thank you very much.
It can be flooding, or it could be severe storms that not have power.
You can hear.
On and on. There are
So
things we
if you
have
have
not
a question,
anticipated
please
when we
wait
build these
for the
plans.
mic so that
So
he can
my
hear your
recommendation
question
is,
here.
over the next 20 or 30 years, let's phase them all out and go with smart grids and distributed generation. I think the future in the 21st century is bright, and it can be achieved with an organized phase out of nuclear power. Last slide is my resume. I'm sure we don't need to go
Arnie,
into
hi,
that,
Erica Frank.
but it's available
Thank you.
if
This
you're
was
interested. And I can take
incredibly
questions for 10
disturbing and
minutes.
important
I'm
to hear.
sorry,
Thank
the
you for
video
that.
apparently did not work.
The cesium deposits in the cedars, are these in your ecosystem in Vermont or in ours here, or how far does that spread, and where are the mollusks and freshwater fish that you discussed? And is anybody in the food industry doing anything to monitor any of these?
Thank you, Erica. I'm sorry I talked so fast. It's a lot of material to get Yeah, thank you, Erica. I'm sorry I talked so fast. It's a lot of material to get through, but I'm glad everyone could come. The cesium in the pollen of the male cedar trees is throughout northern Japan. We also have samples that indicate in southern California. We have one sample that also picked up cesium in cedar pollen. That it appears that 20% of Fukushima's radiation landed in Japan, 78% landed in the ocean, and 2% landed predominantly in America and predominantly in the Cascades. So the amount of cesium we're seeing in the Cascades is dramatically lower than the airborne cesium that we're seeing in the Cascades is dramatically lower than what we're experiencing in Fukushima Prefecture. I don't even know if it will be detectable when the cedars begin to bud in the United States, but we did have someone send us cedar samples that did indicate in Southern California anyway that we had picked up both cesium-137 and cesium-134. When you find the two of them together, that's a Fukushima signature because cesium-134 is a very short half-life. If it was just cesium-137, we wouldn't attribute that to Fukushima because of the fact that that could be from bombs or Chernobyl. But 134 is a short half-life. Now, on your question about fish, as far as I know, the FDA has examined 200 fish out of the millions that have come into the United States since the accident and found no radiation. The United States government basically is not looking at this problem. I'd also expect, I love salmon, and I'm eating it this year because I don't believe the salmon that the cesium has worked its way up the food chain yet. I'm concerned that come about 2013, 2014, we'll begin to see it in the top of the food chain fish, like salmon and tuna.
This is Tom Buchanan.
But right now, I think
calling in
it's
from
too early
Seattle.
for it
I'm
to
here at
have
this
worked its way
event.
up
It's
the food chain. So
exceptionally informative.
if you enjoy
I wanted
fish,
to find out what your
this is
personal
year.
reactions were with your trip
Don't
to
know
Japan.
what I'm going to do
Were
next
you
year.
surprised
Hopefully,
at
I think
anything
the
that
first
you
step is to
had
get the government
witnessed
to
over that
analyze more
week,
fish.
especially? And
It's
what about
possible
the,
that the way we'll
sense
detect
of
this is when a boatload
criticism,
of contaminated
separation
tuna try to
between
come through one of the radiation
people of
portals in the
citizenry
port,
and the government,
and we pick it up
criticism
that way.
of TEPCO.
That's an
What was your
unfortunate
overall
way of
feeling about
measuring the radiation in the
your perspective on the
The
Japanese?
government's got to do a better job, but even as early as April, the State Department was talking to the Japanese and basically said that they're going to look the other way. Next question. Culturally, they are a consensus culture, and they really don't know how to handle conflict very well. Yet the consensus is breaking down, and what I saw was at the citizen level a real distrust for the government. Now, I've seen polls saying it's about 30% to 40% of their citizens no longer trust what the government is saying, and in a country that's based on consensus, 30 or 40% who don't buy in is a real problem. The other issue, though, is that the further away you get from the
I wondered
Fukushima,
if you could expand a
the
little
less
bit more on
their
this
lives are affected. So, you know,
generation problem. I've read reports in local Japanese press
5
of
days in Tokyo
officials
and
scolding
2
people
days
for not
further
wanting
south.
to have
By the way, I found radiation
contaminated
further
waste
south.
trucked
But even
into
in
their
Tokyo,
areas because everyone
most
should
people
share
think
in the
it's
burden
over,
of Fukushima.
and,
And it seems to me like they're
and they
spreading
survived
the
it.
radioactive
And of course,
waste
you know,
throughout the
latency
country with
periods
this
of these
system. Would you
cancers,
comment on that?
It's going to pop up 20 years out, and then people will wonder where it came from. I guess, you know, I don't pretend to be an expert on understanding the Japanese psyche, so I really don't want to go any further than that. I do believe a significant portion of the population no longer trusts their government. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. They are trying to spread the waste throughout the country. You know, now what that does is that if you're going to do demographic data, if you compare Fukushima Prefecture to other uncontaminated areas, you'll be able to get a good handle on the severity of the accident. But if they spread this radiation all over Japan and the country's cancer rate increases pretty much uniformly, it's a lot harder to get good demographic data. I'm not suggesting that that's why they're doing it, but an outcome 20 or 30 years out may be that. You know, we did a calculation on a lined pit. And a lot of the pits that they're putting this in, they claim are lined so that with like a tarp to make sure that the radiation doesn't get out. But even a 2-millimeter hole in a lined pit will release 80,000 gallons of rainwater in the course of a year.
I am
So it's hard to
from
imagine you're
Fukushima
not
in
going to get a
Japan.
2-millimeter hole somewhere in each of these liners. And that cesium then gets
My
into
name
the
is
groundwater or
Aya
the surrounding
from Fukushima and Tokyo in
I'm
Japan.
pretty clear. My position would be
Thank you for lecture for your
not
for your
dilute
lecture.
it, but
I have
keep
two
it in
questions.
concentrated form.
How
And I
can
think
we
you're going to have to
protect our
dedicate
children?
that exclusion
Do you
zone
think?
around
And number two
Fukushima
question
to
is,
be a
do you have
low-level
the plan
radioactive
to
dump.
come Japan
It would be
again?
better, as far as I'm concerned, to truck
Can you hear
it
me?
back to Fukushima and store it within a couple kilometers of the site, and tell people that they're never going home. It's not going to happen, rather than spread that radioactive material throughout a very beautiful and very populated country. Wait, I'm sorry, it's so loud I can't hear you. Yes, I can. Yes. So how can you protect your children? That's the most important question. You know, the Japanese government is using biological effects of ionizing radiation. And they're saying that on the order, if you go in and it's 20 millisieverts per year, only 1 out of every 500 people will get cancer. But that's not a true. Analogy, because what happens is that's for a population as a whole, and it's got old people like me. You know, I'm 63 years old, and 20 years from now, when I get cancer, the odds are I'll be dead from something else. But what happens is it's the kids that are 5 to 10 times more radiosensitive than that average. So you're talking about if children stay in those zones of say 10 to 20 millisieverts, the odds of them getting cancer in over a several year period of being exposed are something like 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 of the children will, by the time they're 30 or 40 years old, develop cancer. For some reason, young women are twice as likely as girls are twice as likely as boys, according to Beer. What can you do? First off, I would not advise going back into a 10 millisievert area, even if the government told me it was safe. But in addition to what they're measuring with their Geiger counters, the biggest problem is that they are not taking into account hot particles, which are the contamination in the corners of the playground, the contamination that gets on the kids' shoelaces. We've gotten people sending us shoes, and they're highly contaminated with cesium, especially on the shoelaces. So what you can do, especially in the Fukushima prefecture, is get out of certainly the 10 millisievert areas and into maybe the 1 millisievert areas, and cleanliness is everything. The Japanese leave their shoes at the door, which is a great beginning, but it's I would vacuum, but I would vacuum with a high particulate efficiency filter, a HEPA filter. I would wet dust. I would not dry dust. If you wet dust, you'll keep the dust on the cloth, whereas if you dry dust, you'll throw it up again. So it's all about personal hygiene and cleanliness if you decide to remain. The dose readings that the Japanese are, everybody's got these little detectors now. That's only for external, and it doesn't include hot particles.
Yes, thank you very much.
And frankly,
Arnie.
I think that's a public relations ploy. And the best thing to do is to watch out for yourself and stay.
Maybe sometime we'll be able to see you in person.
The other thing is
on the screen right now, we have the website for Fairewinds. Arnie and Maggie have collected a vast store of information, video clips, and other material that you may very much enjoy or not enjoy sorting through. It's time for a break now. Thanks a lot.
But if independent scientists are ever to stand a chance here,